Margaret Chen stepped off the city bus, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched her old brown purse. The towering glass building in front of her looked like something from a different world. She had seen it in magazines and on TV, but standing here in person made her feel incredibly small. The Metropolitan Concert Hall stretched up toward the sky, its golden letters gleaming in the morning sun. Fancy cars pulled up to the front entrance, dropping off people who looked like they belonged. In movies, Margaret watched a young woman step out of a sleek black car, her violin case probably worth more than Margaret had earned in the last 6 months at the factory. Taking a deep breath, Margaret walked through the heavy glass doors. The lobby was even more impressive inside. The ceiling seemed to go on forever, with crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen waterfalls. Her worn sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floor, each step echoing in the vast space. She felt completely out of place. Her gray cardigan had a small hole near the left elbow, something she had tried to hide by pulling the sleeve down. Her jeans were clean, but faded from years of washing. She had spent 30 minutes that morning trying to make her hair look presentable, but compared to everyone else here, she might as well have rolled out of bed. The reception desk was a massive curved structure made of what looked like expensive wood. Behind it sat a young woman with perfect makeup and a crisp white blouse. Her nameplate read Ashley, and she looked like she had stepped out of a fashion magazine. "Excuse me," Margaret said quietly, approaching the desk. "I'm here for the piano auditions." Ashley looked up from her computer screen, her eyes quickly scanning Margaret from head to toe. The look lasted only a second, but Margaret caught it. It was the same look she had been getting her whole life, the one that said she didn't belong. "Name?" Ashley asked, her fingers poised over the keyboard. "Margaret Chen." Ashley's fingers clicked across the keys, her perfectly manicured nails making tiny tapping sounds. She frowned slightly at the screen. "I don't see you on the pre-registration list." Margaret's heart sank. I called last week. The man said walk-ins were welcome for the open auditions." "Oh, you're a walk-in." Ashley's tone changed, becoming slightly dismissive. "Well, I suppose we can add you to the list. Do you have your resume and references?" Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper with her contact information and a brief note about her musical background. It's no fancy letterhead, no list of awards or prestigious schools. Ashley glanced at the paper and blinked several times. "Is this your whole resume?" "I don't have formal training," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I've been playing for 25 years. Where did you study?" "I taught myself." Ashley's eyebrows shot up. She looked at Margaret again, this time with obvious confusion. "And you think you're qualified to audition for the Metropolitan Symphony?" Margaret felt her cheeks burn. The advertisement said, "All serious musicians were welcome to try." "I see." Ashley printed out a number on a small piece of paper. "You're number 47. Take a seat in the waiting area. Someone will call your number when it's time." Margaret took the paper and walked toward the seating area. It was like entering a completely different world. The other auditionees looked like they had stepped out of classical music magazines. Their clothes were expensive, their posture confident. Some were warming up with small instruments, filling the air with perfect scales and complex melodies. She found an empty chair in the back corner and sat down carefully. Around her, conversations flowed in multiple languages. She heard discussions about famous teachers, prestigious competitions, and international performances. One young man was talking about his recent performance at Carnegie Hall. A woman nearby mentioned her master's degree from a conservatory Margaret had only heard about on the radio. As more people arrived, Margaret began to realize just how out of place she was. These weren't just musicians, they were professional artists who had dedicated their entire lives to their craft. They had studied at the best schools, trained under world-renowned teachers, and performed on stages around the globe. A group of 3 young musicians sat directly across from her. The first was a tall man in an expensive navy suit, his hair perfectly styled. The second was a woman in a black dress that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. The third was another man, younger, wearing designer glasses and carrying a leather portfolio that looked like it belonged in a business office. Did you see the list of judges? The woman was saying. Professor Williams from the conservatory is here, and that's David Park, the composer. I heard he's incredibly selective. Well, it shouldn't matter for most of us, the man in the navy suit replied. I mean, look at who showed up today. His eyes swept across the room, landing briefly on Margaret before moving on. Some people really don't understand what level we're talking about here. Margaret pretended to look through her purse, but she could feel their eyes on her. She had hoped to blend in, to not draw attention to herself. But everything about her seemed wrong for this place. Is that woman in the corner actually here for the audition? The younger man whispered, not quite quietly enough. She looks like she got lost on her way to somewhere else. Margaret's face burned with embarrassment. She wanted to get up and leave, to catch the next bus back to her small apartment and forget this whole crazy idea. But something kept her in. That chair. Maybe it was the memory of her mother who had always encouraged her to dream big. Maybe it was the 25 years of practice, all those hours alone with her old piano, playing for no one but herself. More people began to stare. She caught snippets of whispered conversations, words like inappropriate and waste of time. Some weren't even trying to hide their amusement. Few people had taken out their phones, probably texting friends about the strange woman who thought she could audition with the professionals. Margaret looked down at her hands. They weren't the hands of a classical pianist. Her fingers were shorter than ideal, with small scars from years of factory work. Her nails were cut short and practical, not shaped for performance. These hands had operated machinery, packed boxes, and scrubbed floors. They had worked hard just to keep her family fed and housed, but these same hands had also brought her joy every single day. In the evenings, after her shifts at the factory, she would sit at her old upright piano and play. The instrument was far from perfect, several keys stuck, and it hadn't been tuned in years. But when Margaret played, none of that mattered. The music that came from her heart transformed everything around her. The waiting area continued to fill with musicians, each one looking more professional than the last. Margaret watched them tune their instruments, practice difficult passages, and discuss techniques she had only read about in library books. She realized that every single person in this room had probably spent more money on their musical education than she had earned in the past 5 years. Yet here she was, holding her simple piece of sheet music, waiting for a chance to play. The paper was worn from years of use, with pencil marks where she had noted fingerings and dynamics. It wasn't a famous piece or a particularly difficult one, but it was hers. She had chosen it because it spoke to her soul, because it told the story of dreams that refused to die, no matter how impossible they seemed. As the morning wore on, Margaret Chen sat quietly in her corner, surrounded by whispers and stares, holding on to the one thing that had never let her down, her love for music. As the morning dragged on, Margaret watched the other musicians come and go from their practice sessions. Each time someone returned from warming up, they looked even more polished and confident than before. She could hear the faint sounds of beautiful music drifting from the practice rooms down the hall. Complex pieces that sounded like they belonged in the world's finest concert halls. The man in the navy suit had introduced himself to several other auditionees as Christopher. He seemed to know everyone, or at least acted like he did. Margaret overheard him mention that he had just finished a tour with a chamber music group in Europe. The way he spoke made it clear he expected to be impressed by others. And so far, Margaret definitely wasn't impressing anyone. "I have to ask," Christopher said, lowering his voice, but not quite enough. "What's the deal with the lady in the corner? Did someone's grandmother wander in here by mistake?" The woman in the black dress, who had introduced herself as Victoria, glanced over at Margaret and then back at Christopher. "Maybe she's here to clean the pianos before we play," she suggested, with a small laugh, though I have to give her credit for commitment. She's been sitting there for over an hour. Margaret pretended to read through her sheet music, but every word cut deep. She had expected this might happen, but experiencing it was so much worse than she had imagined. Her hands trembled slightly. As she turned the page, even though she knew every note by heart, a new group of musicians had arrived. And they were even more intimidating than the first batch. One young man carried not just one violin case, but two, probably worth more than Margaret's car. A woman about Margaret's age walked in wearing a flowing scarf and carrying herself, the kind of grace that only came from years of stage performance. "Excuse me," the woman with the scarf approached the reception desk. "I'm looking for the green room. Need to warm up before my audition." "Of course, Ms. Rodriguez," Ashley replied with a completely different tone than she had used with Margaret. "Down the hall, second door on your right. There's a beautiful Steinway in there for your use." Margaret realized she hadn't even thought about warming up. She had been so focused on just getting here and not running away that she hadn't considered the practical aspects. Even if she had, she wouldn't have known to ask about a green room or practice space. This was all new territory for her. Ms. Rodriguez noticed Margaret sitting alone and walked over. For a moment, Margaret thought someone might actually be kind to her. "Are you waiting for someone?" Ms. Rodriguez asked politely. "I'm here for the auditions," Margaret replied softly. Ms. Rodriguez's expression changed subtly. "Oh? Are you accompanying someone? Playing with one of the other musicians?" "No, I'm auditioning myself for piano." There was a pause that felt like it lasted forever. Ms. Rodriguez looked at Margaret's simple clothes, her worn folder, her nervous posture. "I see. Well, good luck with that." Her tone was polite, but clearly dismissive as she walked away. Margaret watched her join Christopher and Victoria's group. Within minutes, she could see them glancing in her direction and having what was obviously a very interesting conversation. More people joined the group, and soon there was a small crowd of professional musicians, all stealing looks at the woman, who clearly didn't belong. "I heard she's self-taught," someone whispered loud enough for Margaret to hear. "Self-taught? For a Metropolitan Symphony audition? It's like showing up to perform surgery after watching YouTube videos?" The comparison stung. Margaret knew she wasn't like them, but she also knew she could play. She had been playing for 25 years, practicing every single day after work. She might not have fancy degrees or famous teachers, but she had something else: pure love for the music. A young man who looked barely out of college approached her directly. He seemed nervous but curious. "Hi," he said, sitting down in the chair next to her. "I'm David. I couldn't help but notice you've been sitting here alone. Are you okay?" Margaret was surprised by the kindness in his voice. "I'm fine, thank you. Just waiting for my turn." "What are you playing today?" David asked, genuinely interested. "Chopin's Ballade, no?" "One," Margaret replied. David's eyebrows shot up. "Wow, that's a challenging piece." "I'm playing some Mozart myself, trying to keep it safe, you know." Paused. "Where did you study? I don't think I've seen you around the classical music scene." "I taught myself," Margaret said, bracing for his reaction. David blinked several times. "Clearly processing this information? You mean you've never had formal lessons?" "Not really. I learned from books and recordings. I've been practicing for a very long time." David looked confused and slightly uncomfortable. "That's interesting. Well, I'm sure you'll do fine," he said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it at all. He excused himself and walked back to the group, where Margaret could see him sharing what he had just learned. The whispers grew louder after that. Margaret caught fragments of conversations floating around the room. ... Never heard anything so ridiculous. Wasting everyone's time. ... Should have screening requirements. ... Embarrassing for her. Margaret felt her confidence crumbling with each comment. She began to wonder if they were right. Maybe she was being ridiculous. Maybe her years of practice in her small apartment didn't count for anything in the real world of professional music. She thought about her mother, who had died 5 years ago. Her mother had been a pianist too, but had given up her dreams to raise her family. Margaret's old piano had belonged to her mother, who had taught her the first few songs when she was a child. After her mother's death, Margaret had promised herself she would never stop playing. Number 15. A voice called from the front of the room. A coordinator with a clipboard was calling people for their auditions. Margaret watched as a confident young woman stood up, gathered her music, and walked toward the audition room. She moved with the kind of self-assurance that Margaret had never possessed. Through the slightly open door, Margaret could hear the beginning of a flawless performance. "She's going to nail it," Christopher said to his group. I heard her play. At the regional competition last year. Absolutely stunning technique. Margaret realized that many of these people knew each other from the competitive classical music world. They had been playing in the same circles for years, competing against each other, studying under the same teachers, attending the same master classes. She was a complete outsider who had stumbled into their world. Number 23, the coordinator. Called next, another musician stood up, this time a young man with perfectly styled hair and an expensive suit. As he walked toward the audition room, several people wished him luck. He was clearly well-liked and respected in their community. Margaret looked down at her number 47. She was going to be one of the last to audition, which meant she would have to sit here for hours, listening to the whispers and feeling the stares. Part of her wanted to just leave her number on the chair and walk out. She could be back home. In an hour, back to her safe, quiet world where nobody questioned her right to play music. But something kept her in that chair. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the memory of all those evening hours spent at her piano, finding peace and joy in the music. Maybe it was the promise she had made to her mother's memory as the morning turned into afternoon. Margaret Chen sat in the corner of that elegant waiting room, surrounded by the cream of the classical music world, holding onto her simple dream. With both hands, she might not look like them, sound like them, or belong in their world. But she had something they couldn't take away from her, the music that lived in her heart. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the concert hall as the number of waiting musicians slowly decreased. Margaret had watched dozens of talented performers walk through those doors to audition, and each time they returned, they looked either triumphant or devastated. There seemed to be no middle ground in this world of professional music. Number 45, the coordinator called out. Margaret's heart jumped. She was number 47, which meant she was almost up. Her palms were sweating, and she kept wiping them on her jeans, hoping nobody would notice. The remaining musicians in the waiting area had grown quieter as the day progressed, but she could still feel their curious glances. Christopher was still there, apparently waiting for a later slot. He had spent most of the afternoon making phone calls and checking his social media, occasionally looking over at Margaret with obvious amusement. At one point, she had heard him on the phone saying, "You won't believe what I'm seeing here today. There's this woman who thinks she can audition with absolutely no training. I almost feel sorry for her." Victoria had been called earlier and had returned looking confident and pleased with herself. She was now sitting with a small group, discussing the judges and what they might be looking for. Margaret tried not to listen, but it was hard to avoid. Their conversation in the quiet room. "Professor Williams asked me about my interpretation of the piece," Victoria was saying. "I think he was impressed with my analysis of the harmonic structure. And Mr. Park seemed very interested in my performance background." Margaret realized she had no idea how to talk about harmonic structures or formal analysis. She knew how the music felt, how it moved her, how each phrase told a story. She had never learned the academic language that these musicians used so easily. Number 46, the coordinator announced. The man who stood up was the last person between Margaret and her turn. He looked nervous but determined, carrying his violin case like it held his entire future. In a way, Margaret supposed it did. For all of these people, this audition could change everything. She pulled out her sheet music one more time. Not because she needed to read it, but because holding it gave her something to do with her shaking hands. The paper was soft from years of use, and she could see the pencil marks she had made over time, little reminders about dynamics. Fingering suggestions she had given herself, emotional notes about how certain passages should feel. This piece of music had been with her through everything. She had played it when she was sad, when she was happy, when she needed to think, when she couldn't think at all. It had been her companion through lonely evenings, her celebration after good days at work, her comfort when everything else felt uncertain. The violin player from number 46 emerged from the audition room. He looked shell-shocked, neither happy nor sad, just overwhelmed. He gathered his things quickly and left without talking to anyone. Margaret wondered what had happened in there, what the judges had said, what they had thought of his performance. Number 47. The words, hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret felt like everyone in the room was staring at her, waiting to see what she would do. For a moment, she couldn't move. Her legs felt weak and her heart was beating so fast she was sure people could hear it. She stood up slowly, her manila folder clutched tightly in her hand. The walk from her chair to the audition room door felt like miles. Behind her, she could hear the whispers starting again, but this time they seemed louder, more excited. She knew they were all waiting too. See her fail. The coordinator, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked at Margaret with what might have been sympathy. "You're Margaret Chen?" "Yes," Margaret managed to say. Right this way, the audition room was magnificent. Margaret had never seen anything like it. The ceiling stretched up high above her head, decorated with beautiful moldings and soft lighting. But what took her breath away was the piano. It was a grand piano, glossy black and enormous. Sitting in the center of the room like a sleeping giant, at a long table facing the piano, sat 3 judges. Margaret recognized them from photos she had seen in music magazines at the library. Professor Williams was an older man with gray hair and glasses, known for his work at the conservatory. Mr. Park was younger, a famous composer whose pieces Margaret had heard on the radio. The 3rd judge was a woman named Dr. Foster, who had performed with orchestras around the world. "Please, have a seat," Professor Williams said. Gesturing toward the piano bench, Margaret walked across the room, her footsteps echoing in the large space. She could feel the judges watching her every move, probably making notes about her appearance, her nervousness, her obvious lack of professional training. She sat down at the piano bench and immediately realized it was nothing like her old upright piano at home. This bench was adjustable, and she fumbled with it for a moment before getting it to the right height. The judges waited patiently, but she could sense their growing skepticism. "What will you be playing for us today?" Dr. Foster asked. "Chopin's?" "Ballade, no." "One in G minor," Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The judges exchanged glances. Professor Williams made a note on his paper. "It's quite an ambitious choice," he said. "Where did you study this piece?" I taught it to myself," Margaret said, feeling her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I see." Mr. Park leaned back in his chair. "And where did you receive your musical training?" "I don't have formal training. I've been learning on my own for 25 years. The silence that followed felt endless. Margaret could practically see the judge's thoughts. Another delusional amateur wasting their time. She had seen that look before, the polite but dismissive expression of people who had already made up their minds. "Well," Professor Williams said finally, "let's hear what you can do." Margaret placed her sheet music on the piano's music stand, though she knew she wouldn't need it. She had played this piece hundreds of times, maybe thousands. Every note was part of her. Every phrase lived in her heart. She looked out at the judges, then beyond them to the small window at the back of the room. Through the glass, she could see a tree swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. For just a moment, it reminded her of her small apartment, of quiet evenings spent at her piano, of the peace she found in music when the rest of the world felt chaotic. Behind the closed door, she knew the remaining musicians were waiting, probably with their phones ready to record her failure. They expected her to stumble through a few bars before being politely dismissed. They expected to have a good story to tell their friends about the woman who thought she could play with the professionals. Margaret took a deep breath and placed her hands above the keys. The piano was perfectly tuned, responsive in a way her old instrument had never been. For the first time all day, she felt a spark of excitement instead of fear. This was what she had come here to do, not to prove anything to the judges or the other musicians, but to share the music that had been her companion for so many years. The room was completely silent, waiting. Professor Williams had his pen ready to make notes. Mr. Park was looking at his watch. Dr. Foster was studying Margaret with professional interest, probably trying to figure out how quickly they could end this audition. Margaret closed her eyes for just a moment, finding that quiet place inside herself where the music lived. She thought of her mother, who had given her that first piano. She thought of all the evenings when music had been her only friend. She thought of the promise she had made to never stop playing, no matter what anyone else thought. When she opened her eyes, Margaret Chin was ready to play. Margaret's fingers touched the keys, and the first note of Chopin's ballade rang out into the silent room. It was soft, almost hesitant, like a question being asked. But there was something different about that single note, something that made Professor Williams look up from his notepad with sudden attention. The second note followed. Then the third, and suddenly the room was filled with music, unlike anything the judges had expected. Margaret's playing wasn't just technically correct. It was alive. Each note seemed to carry a piece of her soul, a fragment of the 25 years she had spent alone with this music. Dr. Foster leaned forward in her chair, professional skepticism beginning to crack. She had heard this piece performed by countless students and professionals over the years, but there was something about Margaret's interpretation that was completely fresh. The woman's hands moved across the keys with a grace that seemed to contradict everything about her appearance and background. The melody began to build, and Margaret's whole body seemed to flow with the music. Her shoulders swayed slightly, her head tilted as if she was listening to secrets that only she could hear. The judges had expected to hear the stumbling efforts of an amateur, but instead they were witnessing something extraordinary, raw, unfiltered musical expression. Mr. Park, the composer, felt his breath catch in his throat. He had written music himself, had spent years studying the technical aspects of composition and performance. But what he was hearing now was something that couldn't be taught in any school. Margaret was telling a story through the piano, and it was a story that reached directly into his heart. The piece moved into its more complex sections, passages that required years of training to master. Margaret's fingers danced across the keys with perfect precision. But more than that, she seemed to understand the emotional core of every phrase. When the music called for tenderness, her touch became soft as silk. When it demanded power, her hand struck the keys with a controlled force that made the piano sing. Professor Williams had stopped taking notes entirely. He sat transfixed, watching this ordinary-looking woman transform into something magical before his eyes. In his 40 years of teaching, he had worked with prodigies and professionals, but he had rarely witnessed such a pure connection between performer and music. The sound seemed to fill every corner of the room, wrapping around the judges like a warm embrace. Margaret played with her eyes closed now, completely lost in the music. She wasn't performing for the judges anymore. She was simply sharing something that had lived inside her for decades, something that had sustained her through years of factory work and financial struggle. Outside the audition room, the waiting musicians had grown strangely quiet. The music was clearly audible through the door, and what they were hearing didn't match their expectations at all. Christopher, who had been so dismissive earlier, found himself drawn toward the door, straining to hear better. "Is that really her?" Victoria whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. David, the young man who had tried to be kind to Margaret earlier, was standing with his mouth slightly open. "I don't understand," he said quietly. She said she was self-taught. "Is this possible?" The music continued to pour from the audition room, each phrase more beautiful than the last. Margaret had reached the section of the piece where Chopin's genius really showed, the part where the melody seemed to weave in and out of itself, creating layers of sound that spoke directly to the listener's emotions. Margaret's interpretation of this section was breathtaking. She didn't just play the notes, she breathed life into them. Each phrase told a story of longing, of dreams deferred, of quiet strength found in the most unexpected places. The judges could feel the weight of her experiences in every note, the years of practicing alone in her small apartment, the determination that had kept her going when everything else in her life was difficult. Dr. Foster felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She had heard this piece performed in concert halls around the world, but never like this, never with such honesty, such raw emotional truth. Margaret wasn't trying to impress anyone with technical flashiness or academic understanding. She was simply sharing her heart through the music. The piece moved toward its climax, and Margaret's playing became more intense, more passionate. Her whole body was involved now, her face showing the emotional journey she was taking the listeners on. The judges could see that she wasn't just playing a piece of music, she was reliving every moment of practice, every evening spent finding solace in these melodies. Mr. Park found himself thinking about his own journey as a musician. He had studied at the best schools, worked with the most famous teachers, but somewhere along the way, he had lost some of the pure joy that had first drawn him to music. Watching Margaret play reminded him of why he had fallen in love with music in the first place, not for the recognition or the career opportunities, but for the simple, profound connection between human emotion and sound. The waiting musicians outside had completely stopped their conversations. Some had pressed their ears to the door, trying to hear every note. Others stood in stunned silence. Realizing that they had completely misjudged the woman they had been mocking all day, Margaret reached the final section of the piece, where Chopin's melody becomes both triumphant and tragic at the same time. Her playing here was masterful. She understood that the music wasn't just about technical difficulty, but about the human experience of struggle and hope existing side by side. Her hands moved across the keys with increasing intensity, building toward the piece's dramatic conclusion. The judges could feel the energy in the room changing, could sense that they were witnessing something special. This wasn't just a good performance, it was a revelation. Professor Williams realized that his assumptions about musical education had been completely wrong. He had always believed that formal training was essential, that natural talent needed to be shaped and refined by academic study. But Margaret was proving that music could transcend all of that, that genuine artistry could emerge from the most unlikely places. The piece built to its final crescendo, and Margaret's playing reached a level of emotional intensity that left the judges breathless. She wasn't just playing Chopin's notes, she was channeling something deeper, something that spoke to the universal human experience of pain and beauty, struggle and transcendence. As the final notes rang out in the audition room, Margaret slowly opened her eyes and lifted her hands from the keys. The silence that followed was profound, complete, and somehow sacred. The judges sat motionless, still processing what they had just experienced. Margaret looked at them with quiet uncertainty, suddenly aware again of where she was and what she had just done. She had poured her entire heart into that performance, and now she sat vulnerable and exposed, waiting for their judgment. The silence stretched on, and Margaret began to worry that she had somehow disappointed them. She had played the piece as she always did, with complete honesty and emotional truth. But maybe that wasn't what they were looking for. Maybe they needed something more academic, more technically perfect. Outside the door, the waiting musicians stood in stunned silence, finally understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The woman they had dismissed and mocked had just delivered a performance that none of them would ever forget. The silence in the audition room felt like it lasted forever. Margaret sat at the piano bench, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for someone to speak. She could hear her own heartbeat in the quiet, could feel the weight of the judges' stares. Professor Williams was the first to break the spell, but when he opened his mouth, no words came out at first. He began, then stopped, shaking his head as if trying to clear his thoughts. In 40 years of teaching, I have never. He paused again, looking at his fellow judges with an expression of complete bewilderment. Dr. Foster wiped her eyes, not caring that her makeup was probably smudged. She had built her career on maintaining professional composure. But Margaret's performance had shattered all her defenses. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret looked down at her hands. Those same hands that had been mocked and dismissed just hours earlier. "I told you. I taught myself. I've been practicing every day for 25 years. But the interpretation, the emotional depth," Mr. Park said, leaning forward in his chair, "that kind of understanding can't be learned from books. How did you develop such a connection to the music?" Margaret felt a lump forming in her throat. She hadn't expected them to ask about her story, hadn't prepared to share the personal details that had shaped her musical journey. "My mother was a pianist," she said quietly. "She gave up her dreams to raise our family, but she left me her piano. Every night after work, I would sit down and play. It was the only time I felt ... free." The judges exchanged glances, beginning to understand that they had witnessed something far beyond a simple audition. This woman had lived her music in a way that most trained musicians never experienced. "What kind of work do you do?" Professor Williams asked gently. I work at a textile factory, Margaret replied. Third shift, mostly. I get home around 7 in the morning, sleep for a few hours, then practice until it's time to go back to work. Doctor. Foster felt her breath catch. You've been working night shifts and still practicing piano every day for 25 years? Margaret nodded. Music is what keeps me going. When everything else is hard, when bills are due, and life feels impossible, I sit at that old piano and remember that there's still beauty in the world. Mr. Park was staring at Margaret with something approaching. Ah, you said your mother was a pianist. Did she teach you? Only when I was very young, Margaret said, her voice growing softer. She showed me how to sit at the piano, how to curve my fingers, how to find middle C. But then life got busy, and she had to work 2 jobs to support us. I learned the rest from library books and old recordings I found at thrift stores. Library books, Professor Williams repeated, as if the words didn't quite make sense. You learn Chopin from library books. And by listening, Margaret added. I would check out CDs and play them over and over, trying to understand how the great pianists made the music feel alive. Sometimes I would save up money to buy sheet music, but mostly I learned by ear. The room fell silent again as the judges tried to process what they were hearing. Here was a woman who had achieved in isolation what most musicians spent decades trying to master in the finest schools in the world. Outside the audition room, the waiting musicians were having their own moment of reckoning. Christopher, who had been so cruel with his comments earlier, stood with his back against the wall, staring at the floor. I don't understand, he kept saying. I studied at Juilliard. I've had the best teachers in the world. How is this possible? Victoria was crying quietly, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of what she had just heard. I've been playing competitively since I was 5, she whispered. I've won awards, performed in major venues, but I've never played anything that beautiful, never even close. David, the young man who had shown Margaret kindness earlier, felt a mix of shame and admiration. We were so horrible to her, he said. We judged her based on her clothes, her background, everything except what actually mattered. Back in the audition room, Dr. Foster was struggling to find the right words. Margaret, I need you to understand. Something, what you just played. That wasn't just good. That was extraordinary. That was the kind of performance that changes people. I don't understand, Margaret said, confusion clear in her voice. I just played the piece the way I always do. It's exactly the point, Professor Williams said, his voice filled with emotion. You didn't try to impress us with technical tricks or academic interpretations. You just shared your heart through the music. That's what true artistry is. Mr. Park leaned back in his chair, still processing what he had witnessed. Margaret, I've written music that has been performed by some of the world's greatest musicians, but hearing you play Chopin just now, it reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. Margaret felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had come here expecting rejection, prepared for humiliation, but instead, these distinguished musicians were speaking to her as an equal, as an artist. There's something else I need to tell you, Margaret said, her voice trembling. My mother died 5 years ago. She never got to pursue her dreams because life got in the way. But before she died, she made me promise that I would never stop playing, that I would never give up on music no matter what anyone said. Dr. Foster reached for a tissue, no longer trying to hide her emotions. She would be so proud of you right now. I wasn't sure I should come today, Margaret continued. I almost turned around 3 times on the bus ride here, but I kept thinking about that promise, about all those hours she spent teaching me to love music, even when everything else was falling apart. Professor Williams stood up from his chair and walked over to the piano. Margaret, I want you to know that in all my years in music education, I have rarely encountered such pure, authentic artistry. You have something that cannot be taught in any conservatory. What happens now? Margaret asked, almost afraid to hope. The 3 judges looked at each other, and for the first time all day, they were all smiling. Now, said Dr. Foster, we offer you a position as principal pianist with the Metropolitan Symphony. Margaret's mouth fell open. I'm sorry, what? You heard correctly, Mr. Park said, grinning widely. We came here today looking for technical perfection, for someone who could execute difficult pieces flawlessly. Instead, we found something much rarer. We found a true musician. But I don't have the training, the credentials, Margaret protested. You have something better, Professor Williams said. You have the soul of a musician. Everything else can be learned but what you have. It's a gift that most people never find, no matter how much they study. Outside the audition room, word had begun to spread about what had happened. The waiting musicians, many of whom had spent years climbing the competitive ladder of classical music, were forced to confront the reality that true artistry couldn't be measured by degrees or awards. Margaret walked out of that audition room, a different person than the one who had walked in. The same musicians who had mocked her appearance now looked at her with respect and admiration. Some approached her to apologize, others simply to shake her hand and tell her how moved they had been by her performance. Christopher, who had been the cruelest in his comments, approached her with tears in his eyes. I owe you an apology, he said. I judged you based on everything that doesn't matter, and I'm ashamed of myself. You just taught me more about music in 20 minutes than I learned in 4 years at conservatory. As Margaret rode the bus home that evening, she carried with her not just the news of her new position, but the knowledge that her mother's faith in her had been justified. The promise she had made at her mother's bedside had led her to this moment, to the recognition that music truly could transcend any barrier. The woman who had been dismissed as a cleaning lady in the morning was now the newest member of one of the country's most prestigious orchestras. But more than that, she had reminded everyone who heard her play that day what music was really about, not competition or credentials, but the simple, profound act of sharing one's heart with the world.